Russian director Andrey Zvyagintsev has made 5 films since 2003, and they are known for exploring themes of moral and spiritual emptiness, crisis within family and in particular failed fatherhood, criticism of state power and institutions, emotional repression, moral ambiguity, and critiques of modern materialism. His 2003 debut, The Return, established his style. It's a very observant type of filmmaking. Lots of times, much of the narrative running time is made up of appearances of silence, and there's an ambiguity to characters and perhaps even storylines. It's a bleak and beautiful film that may have left me slightly frustrated that it didn't clear up a few narrative loose ends, but as directorial debuts goes, it's an incredibly strong and assertive film that did well both with critics home and abroad, and was to some degrees a box office hit around the world. Even if we're kind of talking kind of figuratively, it made about $5 million, which for a film of this sort and its budget I would imagine was pretty good business. This was followed up in 2007 by The Banishment, which is a somewhat disappointing film if I'm completely honest. Zvyagintsev appears to be too waylaid in trying to make a film that echoes Andrei Tarkovsky, Ingmar Bergman and Michelangelo Antonioni, and I think with The Banishment he forgets what makes those filmmakers interesting in the first place, and instead what we have is a 2-hour film which feels like with slightly more judicial editing could have been brought into a 2-hour film that's far more absorbing than what we get here. It's simply a little bit too oblique, too ambiguous, and although it does have a visual beauty to it, it was for me a fairly empty film. This was followed up again in 2011 by Elena, a film I haven't seen, and then the film where I think he really announced himself to international audiences, which was 2014's Leviathan, which was the first film I saw of his. It won a slew of awards, including the Golden Globe Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and was nominated that year for the Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards. But it's not the film I'm going to be talking about today, because in 2017 I saw what I considered to be his finest work to date, and certainly one of my favourite films of recent years, Loveless. The film is set in Moscow in 2017, and this is not a tourist's eye view of Moscow. It is very much a Moscow of high-rise apartments, abandoned buildings, and deserted forests and incredibly cold-looking rivers. And it focuses on a married couple, Xenia and Boris. The couple absolutely, utterly despise each other and live in a fairly middle-class apartment with their only son, Alyosha. We learn through the course of the narrative that Xenia became pregnant, didn't want to have an abortion, and ended up marrying Boris out of a kind of necessity. She never loved him, he never really loved her, and over the years they've had their child, the couple have come to completely despise each other. Boris already has another partner who is heavily pregnant and works at a sales company. The company is a modern incarnation of a Russian workhouse. Everybody looks the same, everybody eats the same food and drinks the same drinks. Although it has the veneer of being modern, the owner of the company is very much a Christian fundamentalist, and he likes his employees to have a settled family life. It's even rumoured that one employer who was going through a divorce actually brought a fake wife and child to a company do so as not to incur his wrath. Boris is completely obsessed with his job. It's a recurring theme within the work of Zvyagintsev that fathers are typically present, although emotionally absent, and Boris is very much like this. He has absolutely no time for Alyosha. He barely pays him any attention. and we never see him interact with the child in any kind of fatherly way. His partner constantly seeks reassurance that he will treat her and their to-be child differently, which he begrudgingly does, but you get the impression with Boris that she is just in the next line of women he is having a relationship with. Xenia, on the other hand, is a very modern woman. She's the manager of a beauty salon and is completely narcissistic and self-obsessed. She is constantly taking selfies of herself and checking her social media. She is another parent who is present, aka in the vicinity of her child, yet seems to have absolutely no interest other than how many likes she is getting or what is going on in the other world of her friends. She too has another partner, a man a lot older than herself, who represents a kind of new upper middle class Russian. He lives in a minimalist designer apartment and she is completely besotted with him. One night, the couple have a vicious and horrible argument in which they are debating what to do with the child. Neither of them want to take Alicia with them. They simply don't care about him. It's fairly obvious that they both don't love the child and have no interest in raising him. So the plan is to basically send him off to boarding school, after which he can join the military. Unbeknownst to them, and in one of the film's most heartbreaking scenes, the child has heard every single word they have said and is silently screaming in pain at what he is hearing. The next day, he has a frosty conversation with Xenia, and her and Boris go off to their respective partners for a night of sex and drink. The next day, however, the school ring. The child has gone missing, and worse, seems to have vanished into thin air. When someone goes missing in a film, we are conditioned as movie goers to assume that the point of the narrative is going to be to find whoever has gone missing. It might be that the child has been kidnapped and is going to be ransomed to the parents. The point of the narrative of the film will then be trying to find out who has taken the child, why. Are there hidden meanings behind it? Do they need to get hold of money in order to pay some kind of bribe? Is it some kind of conspiracy, perhaps, that local law enforcement is to kidnap children and then corrupt officials are profiteering off it? Yet Antonioni showed us in L'Avventura that when someone goes missing, characters might not be that necessarily interested in getting them back. Boris and Xenia are initially not exactly in panic mode. You would think that this situation would mean that they would be able to put their hostilities to one side temporarily in order to find out what is going on with their son. This doesn't happen even in the first phone call in which they discuss the fact that the child is missing. They cannot help but take potshots at each other personally. They make the decision then to call the police, and one would expect the authorities to be proactive on the case, to show some kind of interest, except they don't. And this isn't because they have anything to hide, it's because they simply don't really care all that much. In fact, the police, when it comes to the department, probably says he's just gone to the shopping mall and he'll be back in a couple of days, as most of them are. But if they really are that concerned, they can rely on a civilian organisation that specialises in tracking down missing people. In effect, the state simply passes the moral obligation of finding the child onto volunteers. There's no sense of urgency, there's no dramatic escalation. And when I first watched the film, I was expecting Xenia and Boris to perhaps do some kind of analysis of their relationship whilst trying to get to find out what has happened to their son. Instead, we see that they are instead still full of resentment, frustration, and self-absorption. Their lives have been completely structured around fighting each other, their self-interests, and planning their futures away from the family unit they have created, which doesn't include the child. And his disappearance is merely an inconvenience that they're going to have to resolve. And what's interesting is what this disappearance does not. It does not bring the parents closer together. It does not bring any kind of meaningful self-reflection. It doesn't interrupt the lives that they are going to have in the future. It doesn't produce any kind of lasting guilt or responsibility, and neither does it change how they relate to themselves and each other. And it begs the question, how have these two people arrived in such an emotionally distant, vacant place? One clue perhaps could be to a visit to Xenia's mother, where they feel the child may have run to, and we find that she is a tyrannical woman who clearly has not much interest in her daughter, and we know from conversation that she also despised her own grandchild. Xenia's apathy, it seems, has been handed down from a generation, and the society of the film and modern Russian society is also taking its toll on the emotional disconnect we see in the film. One recurring theme throughout we see Loveless is televisions playing political news. Slogans about strength and unity are on the airwaves, but daily life continues completely uninterrupted, and to a degree that is the point of all this. The disappearance doesn't disrupt society, it's not news. People simply go about their daily business, and it's a portrait of a country that has normalised a kind of emotional indifference. It doesn't have the corruption that we see in Leviathan, but it is a society that is distracted. And there is one scene which is seemingly completely superfluous to the entire narrative, yet I think is very pertinent to understanding what is going on in the film, which is when Xenia's boyfriend speaks to his own daughter, who is in Portugal, and they are doing so on Skype, and the connection isn't great, and he is asking his daughter when will he see her, and she kind of just brushes it off and says, well, I can see you, and she has no intention of coming back to Moscow and seeing her father. And it's a very telling moment, I feel. He clearly has an emotional need to see his daughter in the flesh and in person, which simply isn't being reciprocated. She doesn't really care, and it reinforces the idea that it's not just Boris and Xenia who are so disconnected. It is Russian society of all generations that have become like this. Even the child, we normally associate with childhood, you have a multitude of friends, and great emphasis is made to highlight the fact he only has a friend, not a group of friends, just a single solitary one who they have made a base with in the basement of an abandoned, what looks like college or secondary school. When it comes to direction in films, I find myself leaning toward a slightly more measured, slower pace. And Loveless is a deliberately restrained film, which is well in keeping with how the characters work emotionally, but directionally, he directs the film in a way that almost feels slightly withdrawn, as if he's refusing to interfere in this world that he has created. And the film doesn't explain or push or rush itself. It simply lets events unfold, and I think places a kind of trust in the weight of what's happening will emerge and reveal itself on its own terms. And it's very much a direction built around what he withholds from scenes. For example, he withholds dramatic emphasis, emotional cues, a form of narrative urgency, which we talked about at the start of the podcast in relation to this being effectively a missing person type thriller, at least on appearances. And what's interesting, there are no moments in the film when the camera says that this is important or this is how you should feel. Scenes will often begin late or even end early, and conversation will drift along rather than having some kind of dramatic climax, and crucial emotional beats happen off screen or in silence. And this creates a feeling that the film is, in a way, not playing up to its audience's expectations. It is simply existing. I think that's reflected in how naturalistic some of the how naturalistic the performances feel. Probably one of the most impactful scenes in the entire film is when Boris and Xenia go to a morgue to look at a body that might be their child's. And there's a moment where Xenia's actually crying her eyes out, and Boris is obviously clearly distraught at what he's seeing, and he goes to touch her and doesn't, and nothing is made of that moment. There's no kind of, you almost want him to, as if they could kind of just bridge this gap between them once, but he restrains himself and puts his hand down. And the film, perhaps another director might try and cut to the hand going close to her, it doesn't, but it almost happens. You almost feel as if it was unscripted, and at the last moment he decided that he couldn't touch her because of how he felt about it, and also how she wouldn't want him to either. The impact of that scene comes through the use of long takes and the static composition, and we often see the camera staying still with characters whilst characters move in and out of the frame, or they continue to speak after the emotional centre of the conversation has already passed. And it gives a sense that the film isn't organised around the drama that's taking place, and that scenes don't have the peak you might believe that they're going to. And it's a style that mirrors the reality of what the characters are going through. They're not processing things in real time or quickly, and the film doesn't either. And his direction treats both Boris and Xenia equally. They are both incredibly flawed people, and you don't get to side with one or the other. And the reason I think this happens is because there's very few close-ups in the film. More often than not, the camera holds characters at a distance, framed within interiors. There's always windows, doorways and corridors repeatedly dividing the frame, which reinforces the theme of the emotional separation that Boris and Xenia find themselves. And it also creates a kind of tension. We are watching people dismantle each other, insult each other, and try and wind each other up, but the film doesn't intervene. We're not put on one side of the other, and we are just allowed to judge what's happening ourselves. The minimalism of the direction is also seen in the sound and the amount of speaking that there is in the film. Dialogue really is kind of stripped to the absolute minimum. There's no long monologues from anyone. The people that come, the volunteers that come to help them, are constantly giving very blunt, very precise and very clinical orders to them. You must call the mortuary, you must do this, you must do that. And they too don't take one side of another. They just act with a kind of complete professionalism. We don't need grandiose speeches. We just need these people to practically go about their business and try and find the missing child. And music is used sparingly through the film. And at times I actually kind of thought it didn't actually need any music at all. But when it does appear, it doesn't swell or underline and direct our emotion. It just kind of sits quietly in the background to layer the film sonically. And I think the restraint that he shows with his direction is that he trusts his audiences to make their mind up. You feel like an observer, and what I like about this kind of style of direction is I think he trusts his audiences to make their own mind up. You are an observer in this film, and watching it unfold in the way that it does, I think many people watching this film will realise quite early on that you are never going to see this child again. And I think that creates an anxiety in the viewer, because we are obviously so accustomed to, one way or another, we will get to the bottom of what has happened to this child. And the film has, I think, another sting in its tail, because during the film's final moments, we come to a quite stark realisation, and that is that although the crisis of this missing child is technically over, life has moved on, and yet absolutely nothing has changed. Both parents are now in new domestic situations, but the emotional dynamics of these are almost identical to what we saw before. There are the same patterns, the same distance, the same seeming irritations, and the same self-absorption. It's like the film is saying that these relationships have been reset and not transformed. And it explores, I think, what is quite a difficult moral aspect of this film, which is that the tragedy of what has unfolded has not produced any type of growth in its protagonists. The disappearance and everything surrounding it has not made these people contemplate their lives and think about how they're going to change and be different in the future. It hasn't opened them up. It hasn't made them gentler or more attentive to the world around them. It's simply been part of their lives and another event that has happened and is now over. And that is deeply anti-cinematic, I think, in the best way, because most films would insist that something must be learned from this, and Loveless denies us that comfort. And there is another aspect to the film's end scenes which I think are really pertinent, especially as what's happened since this in relation to the invasion of Ukraine. But we hear about the conflict in its earliest days, and this isn't dramatised, it's not in the foreground, it's just there going on in the background. It's part of the ambient noise that these people have in their daily lives. It's like the television that we hear constantly at the beginning of the film. And I think what Zvyagintsev is doing is drawing a parallel between the indifference of these characters and the public indifference that has set in Russia at this time. Because just as parents have failed to deal with and register with the disappearance of their child in a meaningful way, the society around them is just seeing this war as some kind of like background information. It's just there going on in the background, yet no one seems particularly engaged with it. And none of the characters really seem to acknowledge it. They don't seem to have any opinion or any kind of thoughts on it whatsoever. They just sit there and listen to it, passively observing it. And I think it's quite a sharp critique of Russia, but not that they are, and not in the way that they are being constantly lied to, but they've learned to kind of coexist comfortably in this world of life. And the film closes out, I think, showing us a society that is numb, one that has lost its way, and he doesn't offer us any way out of this either. And I think in that respect it is an incredibly bleak exploration of not only a marriage but also as a society in general. And that is going to be it for this episode of the 24 Frames Cast. You can email me at 24framescast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Thomas24FC, and you can follow me on Instagram if you so desire. It's mainly just pictures of my cat and whatever films I've been watching, but I am TomJCPFC. So many thanks for listening, and I'll be in contact soon. Bye.